Thank you, everybody, for joining us today at this Replace NAFTA Day of Action event. Today, millions of Americans nationwide are calling, emailing, tweeting Congress, calling for a successful renegotiation of the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. A renegotiation that eliminates NAFTA's job outsourcing incentives and adds enforceable labor and environmental provisions to level up the playing field and raise wages. NAFTA renegotiations have reached a pivot point where the business lobby is urging Mexico and Canada to simply ignore U.S. proposals. Proposals to cut the investor outsourcing incentives at NAFTA's core, incentives to bring down American wages. The corporate strategy increases the prospects that the talks deadlock and President Trump withdraws. In contrast, progressives in Congress and U.S. civil society groups and activists are urging the administration to replace NAFTA with a new agreement that delivers the benefits of expanded trade while eliminating the corporate protectionism now at the heart of NAFTA. Today on social media, a Replace NAFTA Twitter storm reached 2 million people with a thunderclap. And on social media platforms, people are emailing their members of Congress, with 70 organizations taking part in call-ins and writing, with 10 million Americans reached, so that every single member of the House and the Senate will get calls today demanding a new NAFTA that works for working people. With that background, it's my honor to introduce our stellar lineup of speakers, starting with Senator Bernie Sanders. Senator Sanders, in a way, needs no introduction. But I want to say one...
See, I never get introduced anymore. That's what people say, you know. Just a lot, you know, a couple of words would do it.
But I wanted to say one...
About, you know...
She's going to do it. She's going to do it.
But besides saying he is a hero of the progressive movement and a great champion on fair trade, and obviously first the congressman, now the senator from Vermont, the thing I wanted to say first and foremost is that Senator Sanders has been in this fight, as has Rosa DeLauro, Congressman DeLauro, since the original NAFTA fight. And so these are members of Congress who, looking at the original agreement, looked at it and said, this isn't really about trade. This seems like it's a bunch of goodies for corporations. Why can't we have a real trade agreement? And they had the foresight to fight it in the first place. Then Congressman Sanders was a stalwart in that original fight, and he's usually right on most things. This is the one instance where I'm sad to say he was really right about how bad NAFTA would be. And so it is my honor to introduce Senator Bernie Sanders.
Well, let me thank Lori not only for organizing this event, but for the decades she has spent making sure that we have a trade policy in this country which represents the needs of working people and not just the CEOs of large multinational corporations. Let me also thank Randy Weingarten with the AFT, Sister Simone Campbell with Network, Roger Johnson with the National Farmers Union, and my colleague, Rosa DeLauro. Rosa and I came into the Congress together way back when, and we have been fighting the struggle for a very, very long time. You know, trade is not a sexy issue. And it's not something that attracts media attention. But it is an issue which impacts the lives of millions of people, working class people, in communities all over this country. It devastates lives, and it devastates cities and towns, where once there was a vibrant community where people had decent paying jobs, and if they had a union, they had good benefits, and suddenly those jobs are gone, that community withers away, the young people leave. And this is going on all over this country. Trade is not the only explanation for that, but trade is an important part of the decline of the middle class in America. I think, as all of you know, the most important economic reality that faces our country today, again, not something talked about terribly much in the corporate media, is that for 40 years we have been seeing the decline of the American middle class. Despite a huge increase in technology and worker productivity, we have people in Vermont and all across this country who are now working 2 or 3 jobs just to pay the bills. And what people worry about so much is that for the first time in the modern history of this country, their kids are now going to have a lower standard of living than they do, than the parents do. Why is that? Well, a lot of reasons, but certainly one of them is our disastrous trade policies and NAFTA in particular. Today we're here to talk about the fact that since 2001, we have lost some 60,000 manufacturing plants in this country and nearly 5 million manufacturing jobs. Many of those jobs were lost because profitable corporations shut down here and moved to low-wage countries like Mexico and China. This is the issue that Lori has been talking about and studying for decades, and this is an issue that people behind me and many of you have been working on for a long, long time. As you all know, when Donald Trump campaigned for president, he promised that he was going to stop corporations from shipping American jobs to Mexico and other low-wage countries, that he would renegotiate NAFTA and other trade deals to make them much better for American workers, end quote. But as we speak, the renegotiation of NAFTA is being done behind closed doors with 500 corporate lobbyists and executives who are working overtime to protect their interests at the expense of the working people of this country. We are here today to send a very loud and clear message to Donald Trump: for once in your life, keep your promises. Amen. Amen. We need to fundamentally rewrite NAFTA to stop decent-paying jobs from being outsourced to Mexico, to stop corporations from polluting the environment, to end the race to the bottom, and to improve the living conditions in the United States, Mexico, and Canada. We do not need to have a PhD in economics to understand that NAFTA and our unfettered free trade policies have been an absolute disaster. In 1993, Lori will remember this, Rosa will remember this, those of us who have gray hair will remember this. We were told that NAFTA, quote, would create 1 million jobs in the first 5 years, end quote. Senator Mitch McConnell, now the leader of the Senate, promised that, quote, American firms will not move to Mexico just for lower wages. He was as right about that issue as he is right about the tax issue and the health care issue. The Heritage Foundation told us, quote, virtually all economists agree that NAFTA will produce a net increase of U.S. jobs over the next decade, end of quote. Well, they were wrong, dead wrong. Instead of creating 1 million American jobs, the Economic Policy Institute found that NAFTA destroyed more than 850,000 American jobs. NAFTA turned a $1.6 billion annual trade surplus with Mexico into a $64 billion trade deficit with that country. Today, as we speak, the negotiations on NAFTA are taking place behind closed doors. Our demand: open the doors, let working people in. The renegotiation of NAFTA must be done in the open. It must include strong and enforceable labor and environmental standards. It must stop providing incentives for corporations to outsource American jobs to Mexico, where workers there are paid in some cases $2 an hour. It needs to eliminate NAFTA rules that undermine our Buy American and Buy Local laws. It must end the disastrous investor-state dispute settlement system that undermines democracy and allows multinational corporations to put corporate profits ahead of workers, the environment, public health, and food safety. There is a lot of work that has to be done, but I want everybody here to know that on this issue, the need for fair trade rather than unfettered free trade, the American people are with us. Let's go forward together, and let's create a trade policy that works for all of us, not just the CEOs. Thank you all. Okay.
Thank you, Senator Sanders. And our next speaker will be the president of the American Federation of Teachers, Randi Weingarten. And she has been a champion in making the point in this fight and in the TPP that when we are outsourcing good-paying jobs through bad trade agreements, it is the tax base of communities on which teachers and firefighters and our infrastructure, our roads, our schools rely that are also the loser when we lose good wage jobs and wages across America are pushed down. President Weingarten.
Thank you. So we have been involved in the fights for fair trade as opposed to unfettered, free, CEO-based trade for all those reasons that were just said. But most importantly, it hurts communities when you have bad trade deals like TPP and NAFTA. When things get stripped out of communities, when good jobs get stripped, when outsourcing happens and wages are lowered, when the environment gets hurt, when promises are made that are not kept. That's why the teachers union, the nurses union, the non-manufacturing unions are foursquare with our brothers and sisters and amazing advocates like Rosa DeLauro and Bernie Sanders to say no on NAFTA, no on TPP, and no on negotiating another NAFTA behind closed doors like was just done with the tax bill. It is time for Donald Trump to actually act like the populist he ran as opposed to the elitist and the corporate CEO that he's acting as right now. If you make a promise to the American people, keep that promise. And he made a lot of promises to workers. The truth is, he is now attacking them over and over again on health care, on taxes, on public education, and now on NAFTA, talking out of both sides of his mouth, promising to change NAFTA while doing nothing to strengthen the labor and environmental protections that could actually improve the lives of Americans. And so we are here to say, before you thought NAFTA was a sexy issue, we were fighting against NAFTA. Before you thought fair trade was a sexy issue, this group of people were fighting against it, and we will fight to make sure we hold you accountable for the promises you made to the working men and women of America. So, we draw the line in the sand. Today is the beginning of the end for trade deals drafted in secret by and for Wall Street that pauperize working people in the name of growth. We have to expose the deals that allowed NAFTA to be negotiated in the first place. We have to fight to replace NAFTA, eliminate outsourcing, and add strong labor and environmental terms. And let me be perfectly clear, if you didn't hear it yet, the same coalition that fought against TPP, led by people like Rosa DeLauro, are here fighting for fair trade, not free trade, and not a NAFTA rewritten behind closed doors. And this union is part of that fight. Thank you.
Thank you, President Weingarten. That sentiment is what is motivating millions of people across the country today to call into Congress to demand that we get the replacement of NAFTA, to strip out its outsourcing protections, to insert labor and environmental standards, and to make an agreement that works for working people. There is no one on the planet who has fought harder for that goal than our next speaker, Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro. She also is on trade, someone who needs no introduction, but I must just say she has been our fearless leader on the House side, another of the people here who had the foresight originally on NAFTA to know it was not good for working people. She is the woman who on the House side led the organizing that derailed the very dangerous expansion of NAFTA through the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and a great champion for working people, Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro of Connecticut.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you. Thank you so much, Laurie, and thank all of you. I'm so proud to stand with Democratic colleagues, Bernie Sanders, to the folks who are not colleagues, but the voices for labor, for social justice, with Randy Weingartner and Sister Simone and President Johnson, President Knowlton. All of the folks here today, it's been said, have been fighting the battle against tremendous odds. And we won on the TPP fight. We did. We stopped it from happening. And, I just want to reflect for a moment, because I was here for the NAFTA agreement. And I worked very closely at that time with David Bonnier and with Richard Gephardt, and went to meetings every week with David Bonnier and as to figure out how we were going to thwart this effort. And we knew going into this effort about the millions of jobs that were going to be lost. And we fought hard. But in those last few days, the negotiating and the selling of whatever it was that someone needed in order to have their vote, it was like sand moving through your fingers. And we didn't have the ability to stop it. I'm not ashamed to tell you, the power of the arguments that night on the floor, I can still remember them. They were with us. They were with the American workers. But we didn't have the votes. And I left the floor that night in tears. And I was a newly elected member of the Congress, because we said it was going to be such a detriment to what families in this nation. And you don't want to say, I told you so. But we told you so.
Amen.
We told you so. And I will tell you, just with regard to TPP, that it was in my gut that we were not going to go down that same road where at the last minute they were going to snatch victory for themselves and once again leave us holding the bag. And I'll speak for my Democratic colleagues, 160 strong, who never moved away from voting against fast track and for voting against the TPP. So that's the kind of resolve, I will tell you, that coalition still exists. And we meet every Wednesday. And from here, many of you will be at that meeting to talk about what we are going to do about the renegotiation of NAFTA. And this is about eliminating the incentives for outsourcing jobs, raising wages, level the playing field for working people in North America. Because the biggest economic challenge of our time is that people are in jobs that just don't pay them enough money today. They are struggling. They can't put food on the table. They can't send their kids to school. They can't pay for their health care costs. They struggle day to day. And our job is to alleviate that struggle. And so that what we need to do is, when we look at NAFTA and how it allows companies to outsource their jobs, to make their wages lower, we say, no, you're not going to do it. And a rewritten NAFTA must include fully enforceable rules that raises standards on the ground in Mexico. Corporations should no longer be allowed to move manufacturing centers south of the border just to exploit low-wage labor, to dump toxins into the environment. And my friends, this tax cut bill exacerbates the problem of outsourcing jobs overseas. We've got to continue, even though they're just a very few days or hours, we've got to continue to press to defeat this tax cut bill. It is an abomination for the people of this nation. Since NAFTA, Mexico's already low wages are down 9%. Poverty is up. Because of unfair competition, U.S. wages are stagnant, while American families feel the squeeze from rising costs all around them. Corporations get richer, and workers everywhere are exploited by a rigged system. Transparency, you bet we need transparency. We fought hard with regard to TPP to make sure it was transparent. And that's the process that we want to make sure we have in the rewriting of the NAFTA agreement. And we have to make sure, if we have workers at the center of our goals, that we will not repeat the same mistakes we have already made in the past. Those mistakes that have hemorrhaged jobs and hurt working people and have hurt the middle class. You know, NAFTA has been said already directly contributed to the outsourcing of about 1 million good-paying American jobs, including about 60,000 of those jobs in my home state of Connecticut. And that only accounts for job losses that have been, quote, certified by the Labor Department. While employees suffer, their employees suffer, NAFTA enables large corporations to outsource more and more middle-class jobs. Recent examples, GE, Carrier, Nabisco. He said he was going to protect those jobs when he was out there. Just one more lie to the American people. How long will we lose jobs to places that have slave wages and no worker protections? We have a moral obligation, a moral responsibility to level that playing field for the middle class and not put corporations above everything and everyone else. We have a historic opportunity, and that's why we're seizing it, to shape the future of American trade. We are for trade. We're not going to let them paint us in the way, quite frankly, my Democratic colleagues who sat in the White House, who said we were thugs, those of us who fought against NAFTA, and in most recent Democratic administration told us we didn't know what we were talking about with regard to ISDS. We do know what we're talking about. We know what we stand for. And we want to make sure that that future for trade really puts Americans first. We want to work with the administration. We want to rewrite NAFTA, ensure working people and their congressional representatives have a seat at the table. That's what we came here to do. But if we allow corporations to drive that NAFTA renegotiation in a closed-door process, then the deal will be even worse than what we experienced all those years ago. My friends, the time is now. You know that Congress is an institution that responds to external pressure. You are the external pressure. Let's make it happen. Let's renegotiate NAFTA on behalf of the American people.
All right, the first thing to say there is amen.
Amen.
And appropriately, our next speaker is the amazing Sister Simone Campbell, who is the head of Network, the Catholic Social Justice Lobby, and maybe known to many people as one of the leader of the Nuns on the Bus. A movement that actually got some of my friends from high school going back to church. Ooh. They were so inspired. They thought, they thought that's the Catholicism I'm for. I'm going back to church. The faith community has been a key part of the movement for new pro-people, pro-human rights trade policies, and it's my honor to introduce Sister Simone.
Thank you, Lori, so much. And what an honor to stand with this illustrious group. What we know as people of faith here in D.C. is that NAFTA needs to be renegotiated. Renegotiated not in the dark, not in some back room, but in public where the people's voices can be heard. We, as people of faith, have this radical idea that we ought to practice democracy. We ought to practice what we preach where everyone's voice gets heard. And Pope Francis says that working for a just distribution of the fruits of the earth and human labor is not mere philanthropy. It is a moral obligation. For Christians, the responsibility is even greater. It is a commandment. So for us as people of faith, we say this commandment needs to be engaged by the very people who are so concerned about whether or not we're saying Merry Christmas. It is so much more important that we actually live our faith than to give lip service in a convenient, polarizing way. Faith is about coming together to ensure that the needs of those most marginalized are cared for. That is the story of Christmas. And in a show of collaboration, our U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, the bishops from Mexico have written a joint statement saying that NAFTA needs to be renegotiated in public for the sake of those who are most vulnerable, most marginalized. That NAFTA has created a crisis in the U.S. and Mexico, and we need to face it. In Mexico, I'm a sister of social service, and we have sisters in the state of Michoacan in Mexico. And our sisters in Michoacan know the dislocation of agricultural workers from around the state because they can no longer make a living on their terreno. In the rancho, where they have historically for generations been able to support their families, they can no longer do it because of NAFTA prices. They know the pain of their families. One of our sisters, a young sister, a new member of our community, came to Los Angeles, our headquarters, for the first time last Pentecost. And for the first time in 7 years, she saw her father, who is working here as an agricultural worker, without documents, but can't go back. In the United States, we have a crisis about immigration, and we all act surprised. What are these people doing here? These people are here because we've made it impossible for them to make a living at home. It is wrong that we create this dislocation. It is wrong that we drive people off their historic land. It is wrong that our people cannot get a good price for their corn. It's simple and it's wrong. So what we know as people of faith is that what we need is a policy, is a trade agreement that acknowledges the needs of the common good, not just of the multinational, that acknowledges the need of the hard-working agricultural worker on the small little plots of land in the U.S., in Mexico, in Canada. All over, it's the same reality. We're pushing people out, and that's wrong. We know the common good demands that we have good education, that we have good services in our cities and towns, that we're not afraid of each other because of immigration that's been forced because of bad trade agreements. We're better than that as a nation. We're better than that as a hemisphere. We can do better. And so, as people of faith, I join our Washington Interfaith staff colleagues as we come together and issue our own letter saying no to NAFTA, no to backroom negotiations, no to this obscure preference for those at the very top. This is true for our tax policy, it's true for healthcare, and it's true for trade. We, the people, can make free trade, fair trade, and that should be the Christmas present, the Merry Christmas present that we give to our nation. Thank you very much.
Sister Simone made the perfect connection onto agriculture, because small family farmers in the U.S., independent farmers in the U.S., small farmers in Mexico, farmers in Canada, none of them are getting a price that can support their lives, their livelihoods, and their families on their farms right now. The big grain trading companies have been doing very well by NAFTA. Our next speaker is going to help us understand what kind of new NAFTA deal would be good for farmers, keeping the trade part of the trade agreement, which has benefits, and getting rid of some of the baggage. The National Farmers Union represents farmers 200,000 and ranchers across the U.S. Mr. President Roger Johnson was the state president of one of the chapters, a farmer himself, and is now the president of the National Farmers Union. Roger Johnson.
Thank you, Lori, and thanks for the invitation to this event. Trade is something that is essential. We all need to experience the benefits of trade. It's essential to agriculture. It's essential to American farmers and ranchers who are incredibly productive and grow and raise more than we can consume domestically. So we need trade to share that with others on this planet. The farm economy has undergone a very serious economic downturn in the last 4 years. Net farm income is now half of what it was 4 years ago. Commodity prices are across the board about half of what they were at the peak. U.S. agriculture has integrated supply chains with Canada and Mexico, and these relationships are important, especially now. NAFTA renegotiations must be approached diplomatically and with respect. We need a new NAFTA that preserves the duty-free access to agricultural markets. We need a new NAFTA, a deal that will improve the lives of family farmers and ranchers, not make them worse. Most farmers and ranchers have off-farm jobs in order to provide living for their family. That added income, and in many cases, that health insurance that's so essential, is necessary. So jobs are important to farmers, just like they are important to all of the rest of us. A better NAFTA, a renegotiated NAFTA, needs to address currency manipulation so that countries can't cheat. It needs to address the massive trade deficit that we have in this country. And let me deviate just a little bit and explain that in agriculture, we have a trade surplus in the U.S. That's a very good thing. That means that we sell more stuff to other countries than we buy from them, food and agricultural products. That creates jobs here. That increases standards of living. The problem is that trade surplus in agriculture is swallowed up by the enormous overall trade deficit that the rest of the economy has. It's almost insignificant in the whole context. We have a $500 billion trade deficit in this country that is directly responsible for millions of jobs having been outsourced and a 3% drag on our GDP. So dealing with the trade deficit is an enormously important piece of renegotiating NAFTA and other trade agreements. We have long called for a new approach to trade agreements. Now is the time to keep what has worked for farmers, but to fix what has long been broken.
Thank you very much, President Johnson. Our next speaker is Hector Sanchez. He's the president of LACLA and also is elected by his peers to be the chair of the National Hispanic Leadership Council. Hector has been a long fighter as well for fair trade for all the Americas. Hector.
Thank you. Thank you, Lori, for putting this together. We've been fighting this for a long time. It seems like we keep coming back to this important fight. And thank you, Senator Sanders, Randy, Congresswoman, sister, brother. Thank you, everybody that have been fighting for this important issue. This is a workers' issue. And I just want to reflect on, not to repeat a lot of the fantastic arguments that have been made, but just to reflect on an important point of why this is a workers' issue. How do we explain that today, almost 2018, the most powerful nation in the world, we have 3 people having the same wealth as 50% of our population? a country that claims to be the most sophisticated, most advanced, most egalitarian nation in the world. It doesn't make sense. How do we explain that Mexico, probably our most important partner, at some point had the richest person in the planet, with 7% of the total GDP of Mexico, when 50% of our Mexican brothers and sisters live in poverty? This is directly correlated to NAFTA and policies like NAFTA. Policies that open the way for people to concentrate such a huge amounts of wealth and not sharing that wealth with workers in the nation. Like Senator Sanders said, the productivity has increased historical records. Why are we not sharing that wealth with workers? I want to be very clear. We welcome trade. We oppose this kind of NAFTA trade, a trade that is against workers. We don't oppose globalization. We oppose this kind of globalization. We welcome the globalization of the middle class. We welcome the globalization of unionization. We welcome the globalization of a living standards for all the workers around the globe. We welcome that kind of globalizations. We oppose globalization that creates billionaires all over the world and it creates a working class that continue being exploited and evaporating the workers' rights of everybody. NAFTA was bad for workers in Mexico. NAFTA was bad for workers here. And while we're talking about this issue, we can connect it to the important issue of immigration that we're facing today. It's time to stop being a hypocritical nation on the issue of immigration. This is an issue that is directly correlated to NAFTA. How do we explain that we as a nation, with all the technology that we have, with the biggest army in the world, we have 12 million undocumented people living in our communities? It's because we are addicted to cheap, exploitable, and disposable labor. And this is directly correlated to policies like NAFTA. NAFTA displaces farmers from the communities over there in Mexico. NAFTA displaced workers all over the nation, and NAFTA didn't create work in the cities. And at the same time, the U.S. is asking for this kind of jobs. So we need to change this kind of policies, and we need to always have policies that are good for workers. And at the time that we're renegotiating this issue, when we move forward with this issue, we need to make sure that workers are sitting at the table. Not only CEOs, not only corporations with the politicians that they want on that table, workers must sit at the table to make sure that every negotiation is good for the middle class and for the working class in the nation. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Hector. Our last speaker is Peter Knowlton, who is the president of the UE. His union is among the many American unions that have representing manufacturing workers that have seen literally 930,000 more than that, because those are just the jobs lost to NAFTA, outsourced to NAFTA, almost 1 million jobs. Those are that's just the number certified by the U.S. government under a program that only counts a certain number of jobs. People who are watching at home by webcast can look up the job loss in their state at tradewatch.org, at the Trade Data Center. It has the entire NAFTA, almost 1 million TAA jobs listed. It is nationwide, and the story of UE, sadly, is a story of many of America's great manufacturing unions.
Thank you, Lori. Thank you, Lori. And thank you for all the panelists that are here. My name is Peter Knowlton with the United Electrical Radio Machine Workers of America. After more than 2 decades of NAFTA and the outsourcing that it encourages, UE members know how devastating the trade deal is and has been to manufacturing workers and manufacturing communities across the United States. Communities like Erie, Pennsylvania, and Eden, Ohio, and my own community of New Bedford, Massachusetts, have seen their local economies hollowed out by layoffs and plant closings as corporations outsource jobs, lured by low wages and lax environmental standards in Mexico and in other low-wage countries. When manufacturing workers in the U.S. attempt to organize workers, the most effective tool workers have to address runaway inequality, they are met with threats to move their work to Mexico. It happens to our members on a consistent basis who work in manufacturing. General Electric, as a matter of fact, at one point used to require some of their outsourced suppliers to set up shops in Mexico if they wanted to continue getting contract work through General Electric. This pushes wages down for the jobs that do remain here. The issue is not that Mexican workers are somehow stealing our jobs, but that corporations take advantage of the abysmally low wages and living standards in Mexico. Mexican workers make roughly 1/10 of what U.S. and Canadian workers make. And their already low wages have declined by 9% since NAFTA went into effect. And I just want to echo really quickly the devastation that Monsanto and Cargill caused on the Mexican people after NAFTA was passed. Yeah. Over 5 million family farmers are thrown off their land and had no place to go but north to the United States. That's why so many people came. And it's been repeated by speakers here, but people really need to understand NAFTA was not just devastating to the U.S., it was incredibly devastating to the Mexican economy and to the Mexican people in ways that we can't even imagine in the United States. We must take concrete steps by adding strong labor and environmental standards and swift and certain enforcement mechanisms for those standards throughout the continent. This is the kind of renegotiated NAFTA that we need to rebuild our manufacturing base in the U.S. UE members across the country are making calls today to their representatives to demand this. And we are proud to stand with our allies and our friends here today and with our allies in Canada and in Mexico to demand a renegotiated NAFTA that works for working people throughout the North America. And if we don't get a better NAFTA, we're better off not having any NAFTA at all. Thank you.
Right, before I open up our event today to questions from the press, I just want to sum up with one sort of situational update, which is the most recent set of NAFTA negotiations are rounding up today. In Washington, D.C., the next slated set of and the last scheduled set of negotiations are in the beginning of January in Canada. NAFTA renegotiations are supposed to end by the beginning of March. So right now is the pivot point, the decision point about what kind of outcome of these negotiations we're going to see. And the coalition you see here is fighting for a new deal that basically get the benefits of expanded trade without the corporate protectionism that's been at the heart of the NAFTA. The agenda is very clear: to cut the outsourcing incentives now at the heart of NAFTA and the investor state tribunals that have allowed continuing attacks on environmental and labor laws, and to insert the missing pieces: strong labor and environmental standards with swift and certain enforcement. That is the path to an agreement that works for working people. And with that, I open the floor to questions from the press. Please identify who you represent, and ask your question. Doug.
Yeah, the last speaker, Mr. Knowlton, said that if the deal you can't get a better NAFTA deal, better off not having a NAFTA at all. I just wondered if that's the issue that if there isn't an approved agreement, that the United States should withdraw NAFTA.
I'll certainly let everyone speak for themselves. I would say right now everyone's very focused on what's going on right now, which is the renegotiations. And we are fighting to get a deal we can support. Because certainly the status quo of NAFTA outsourcing more middle-class jobs every week and empowering corporations to file every week more investor-state corporate attacks on our environmental and health safeguards is not acceptable. We want NAFTA renegotiated to raise standards and stop the outsourcing incentives. Otherwise, companies will continue to move U.S. jobs to Mexico, pay workers their poverty wages, and dump toxins, and then import the products back here. So, yes, the status quo is not acceptable, but President Trump promised to bring manufacturing jobs back to the United States and to raise wages. And if he fails to get a NAFTA replacement deal that accomplishes those goals, more Americans are going to be forced into lower wage jobs. Wages in Mexico are not going to be increased. And overall, North American workers will be in a bad situation. Having no NAFTA, the status quo is worse than having nothing, but success is having a new deal that actually accomplishes our goals. And everyone should speak for themselves. If there's anything to add.
I don't think that there is anything to add. I would just say that I'm not going to accept the finality. I think our job is to push the edge of the envelope to make sure that we get a renegotiated deal that meets the needs that we have been talking about today, whether it is ISDS. We need to call attention to the kinds of pressures that corporations are putting on this process in the same way they've done in the past, and that is what has to get defeated. That's where we have to go, focusing our attention and making sure that they are not going to be the beneficiaries that they have been in the past, and that American workers, that North American workers are going to be those beneficiaries. Our job is to push that edge of the envelope, which is what we are going to continue to do until we get success.
Canadian Press. Unfortunately, President Weingarten had to go to a congressional hearing that she was speaking at. So I'm going to actually ask Peter if you may to address that, and anyone and Congresswoman DeLauro, who probably had to run to a meeting also. But I can send you to the right people to answer that question also.
So I'll just answer really briefly. I mean, the differentiation in wages between U.S., Canada, and Mexican workers is so astronomical that for us, a successful NAFTA negotiation really has to raise the wages of Mexican workers substantially, because then it begins to level the playing field. And one of the biggest problems that we have in any negotiations in manufacturing is the threat by the employer to move our jobs if we don't agree to this concession, that concession, this concession. Essentially, defined pension benefits are gone in this country and have been eviscerated since NAFTA in the last 20 years. Health insurance prices are increasing at an astronomical level. Every time across the table, the employer says to us, if you don't agree to this, this, or this, we're going to have to more seriously consider moving our jobs, either to Mexico or to some other low-wage country. So for us, the only way to increase the playing field is you have to raise the floor. If you raise the floor, you support the ceiling. But if you continue the floor and the floor keeps going down, the structure is going to fall apart eventually. So for us, that is critical, and the Mexican independent trade union movement in Mexico is very clear about this respect, is that they need to raise their pay in order for them to be able to provide a better standard of living for their communities and their families, but also, frankly, to be able to, they understand the relationship of our job losses and what's happened with going down to Mexico. Well, most people, in 1994 to 96, Mexico lost 365,000 textile jobs to China. So the issue is, how floored does the low have to go before corporations become satisfied? So for us, you need to level the playing field.
Can I add a piece? And for people of faith, what becomes critical is wages in all three nations. And what we have to look at is, yes, the reality in Mexico and what the Mexican workers get paid. But what's happening here in the United States that I'm more familiar with than Canada is this threat of not having a job at all, so we pay low wages, just with this idea that we could get by in order to shift more money to the top. And the big structural change that would occur if NAFTA is negotiated in public is that it would put workers at the table. It would shine a light on the corporate desire to get yet more money at the top, which is the big part of our tax fight right now. And it would also put a light on the fact that our workers' wages have been stagnant, and this so-called safety net has become a business subsidy in the United States. And we, the people of faith, know that's wrong for our nation, that workers should be able, who work hard full-time, should be able to support their families, and that's the bottom line for us moving forward.
And I would refer you to our friends at the AFL-CIO, specifically Celeste Drake and Kathy Feingold, two experts on international labor standards who've been working on this issue for years and years, who can give you some very specific recommendations about exactly what would make the difference to ensure swift and certain enforcement of strong standards that meet with the fundamental international standards. That is the ask across the entire coalition. And if you want to get into the detailed what agreements, et cetera, to model after, Kathy and Celeste are your gals. On the procurement issue, to summarize the position of U.S. civil society for a very long time, we don't actually believe that procurement policy should be set one-size-fits-all and locked in place in trade agreements. Why should closed-door negotiations with only one set of interests, the business interests at the table, decide how the federal government, much less states or localities, decide to spend taxpayers' funds? The taxpayers democratically should be able to decide that through resolutions, through voting in representatives, for instance, in Congress, representatives who support, if it's what, and it does, 80% of the polling shows, people in America want Buy American. They want their tax dollars recycled into their community. I bet people in Canada would like Buy Canada, so that when your tax dollars get spent, it's to buy things made in Canada, so that you actually are invigorating your economy, building jobs. It's a policy tool. Procurement is not free market purchases. It's the government. It's our policy. It's our taxpayers' funds. So our position has long been trade agreements shouldn't have that policy, and where it comes from is U.S. companies who wanted to outsource jobs to lower wage countries, originally Mexico, wanted to still have the right to bid on government contracts in the U.S. So for the GEs, for the car companies who still wanted the government to buy their goods, they wanted to meet Buy America, they wanted the waiver, they wanted to go to Mexico. We should be able to set terms that raise wages, that are investing in communities. If we want to have food for school lunch programs grown here to support local agriculture and limit the long-distance transport, if we want buy local, the taxpayer should be able to decide, and that should be true in all three countries. So that's been a long-standing position. And with that, I'm going to wrap up because we promised to be clear of this room that Senator Sanders' office graciously got for us. Thank you, Senator Sanders, again, and to all the speakers. Thank you all, everyone who's watching at home, and thank you for all the participants who came. This is the end of this event of the NAFTA Action Day, but the NAFTA Action Day rolls on with phone calls, hopefully bringing down the Capitol switchboard as we speak. If you have not called, call early, call often. Make sure you're a member of Congress is for a replacement of NAFTA that raises standards and ends the outsourcing. Thank you very much.
Glad to do. Yeah. My friend, I was in South Dakota for 2.5 years.